As Europe rebuilt itself from the ruin of World War II, there was a requirement to get the masses moving to fuel the economic recovery. As such, the automobile industries of each respective country set about developing cheap and cheerful people's cars that, unbeknownst to them, would go down in history as some of the most iconic classic cars on the road. From West Germany came the Beetle, Italy produced the Fiat 500, France the Citroën 2CV, and while the West will forever mock it, the Trabant served its role as transport for many in the DDR. In similar need of a car for the majority, the UK produced the Morris Minor, which would later be succeeded by the Mini. Of all the cars in the world, the Mini is more so than any other the lovable, happy-go-lucky hero. It was an economy car that won rallies and raced alongside Mustangs. It can be seen in countless movies where it grants freedom to our protagonists and catalyzes romance. Even non-car people recognize and like Minis, the true signifier that a car has superseded the car scene and become a public icon in its own right. Alec Isagonis's ingenious, timeless design produced a car that stuck to the road like glue, swallowed people and luggage with clown car-like capability, and perhaps most importantly of all, looked adorable. That's mostly where documentaries cut off and move on. The Mini was brilliant, Isagonis is a god, and when British Leyland was getting shitter, the Mini went beyond better and better. But as warm and cozy a narrative as that is, and as much as I hate to be a killjoy, it simply doesn't reflect reality. The well-known stories of these people's cars always have something they're trying to hide. The Beetle, of course, was initially designed to be sold through what can only be described as the Nazis' agency of state-mandated fun, while Porsche so heavily lifted its design from the Tatra V570 that post-war Tatra sued and won. Meanwhile, the 2CV takes all the glory for France, while the Renault 4 did as much if not more of the heavy lifting. And in much the same way, the Mini was outsold by its stablemate, the BMC AD016, for much of its glory years. In all fairness, the AD016 was essentially an extended four-door Mini with funky suspension, but people point and laugh at an Austin 1100. They point and cheer at a Mini. In this period, the Mini sold well and reliably, but it didn't single-handedly mobilize the British population, as is the myth of the people's car. As such, it is very possible that had the cards fallen differently, another car could have ingrained itself into British cultural identity. Mr. Bean's armchair could have sat atop a vehicle that very well could be considered a bizarro Mini, a car different in so many ways, yet somehow so similar, achieving many of the same feats with some equally clever engineering, some of which Isagonis himself declared impossible. But how could such a vehicle exist? What possible shape could it take? I can't keep this shit up. It's a Hillman Imp. The Imp is a product of the oft-forgotten second homegrown British auto industry giant, the Rootes Group. The history of Rootes deserves a video unto itself, but here's the crash course. Just after the luxury brand Humber bought the mass-market Hillman, the Rootes brothers bought a controlling stake and joined the board. The Super Rootes brothers were well-known auto industry magnates, having built a dealership empire from their flagship building in Maidstone, a fantastic curving slab of Art Deco. After taking control of the board, they bought the van and lorry manufacturers, Carrier and Tilling-Stevens, and the unfortunately named STD Motors. Go on, get your laughs out, I know you want to. Which consisted of Sunbeam and the British arm of Talbot. Finally, by the mid-50s, the Talbot name was dropped and Singer was acquired. By this point, the Rootes brothers had built themselves a veritable motoring imperium, mimicking the Detroit model of having different marques for different price levels and markets as BMC had. At the top was Humber, which dealt in the great British tradition of walnut and leather-laden barges. Positioned below as the more economic luxury option was Singer, sporting options were provided by Sunbeam, and Hillman at the bottom provided no-thrills, low-expense motoring. However, despite Hillman's entry-level position, they suddenly found themselves in a pickle with the advent of the Suez Crisis of 1956. For the first time since the war, petrol rationing was reintroduced and the products of Germany began assailing the British Isles in large numbers, although said products of BMW, Messerschmitt and Heinkel now looked less like this and more like this. Suffice to say, this was not favourable for Rootes. The cheapest car Hillman made, the Minx, had steadily grown over the years to become by European standards a mid-size car, and whose smallest 1.4-litre engine sat outside the 800 to 1000cc segment that had quadrupled in sales in the year following the crisis. This was because the Kingdom of Roots was built on the foundation of the bougie middle class. Baron William Roots had a distaste for economy cars because he thought making them would cheapen his brand's image, which he had named after himself. Finally, although they didn't know it yet, BMC's launch of the Mini on the horizon only wound Roots' doomsday clock further forwards. Roots needed to compete in the economy segment to stay relevant, and as if that weren't enough pressure, they needed whatever this new car would be to succeed. Roots' depressed sales following the crisis left them with enough cash to fund a big development program, but not enough for anything much afterwards, meaning whatever they spent it on had to pay for itself, turn a profit, and save the company from stagnation and the massive amount of foreshadowing I am lathering onto this sentence. Whatever Roots spent its money on would be a massive gamble. So naturally, when management looked at the small car project the engineers had been working on and found out it had been nicknamed the Slug, they didn't exactly have high hopes. As it turns out, the name applied twofold. The power plant was a Villiers two-stroke flat twin that wouldn't worry a practiced cyclist, while the body shape was... well, yeah. In a very uncharacteristically forward-thinking move for British auto industry management, a less bare-bones car was requested. Not, of course, because it was anticipated that even the most desperate buyer doesn't want something so devoid of aspiration, but because the Roots Group will not be seen producing a product so clearly designed for austerity, nor something so awfully hideous. William Roots, the real brains of the Roots duo, wouldn't even be seen being driven in it. So the Slug was salted and its designers, Michael Parks and Tim Fry, were sent back to the drawing board. To keep things simple and prevent money from the Slug being wasted, Parks and Fry, or Mikey P and T Fry as they were known, decided to simply scale up the fundamentals, retaining the rear-engined rear-wheel drive layout. The new design was given the much more exciting name Project Apex, which I can only imagine was to erase any chance of a repeat of the Slug. Work was hastened following the Mini's launch, but the original concept was largely kept, despite the praise the Mini received for its advances, which, with hindsight, would define small economy cars from there on out. The Imp is therefore on paper very different from the Mini, which famously pioneered transversely mounting the engine in the front, while the Imp stuck with the older, cheaper layout of longitudinally mounting the engine in the rear. For this reason, haters, in between licks of Isagonis' shoes, decry the Imp as archaic, for failing to make any technological advancements the masses deserve. This is of course ignorant twaddle, for the Imp made its innovations in other areas, most of which are curiously ones the Mini neglected. The engine is another common source of ridicule, being derived from a fire hose pump. However, that fire hose pump was itself derived from the legendary Coventry Climax racing engine. Hence the Imp's dinky little straight 4 features an overhead cam and an all-aluminium construction, a world-leading claim and a first for a UK mass production car. This was a far cry from the BMCA series found in the Mini that still used push rods and probably still had bits of dirt and widowed miner in the cast iron block and head. Additionally, the gearbox featured synchromesh on all forward gears, whereas the Minis at the time did not. What's synchromesh? Oh, you bet your fucking ass it's nerd time! In ye olden days, especially if you owned a cheaper manual car, it was common for it not to feature synchromesh on some of the lower gears. This meant in order to shift correctly, you had to exactly match the rev range of the gear you wanted to change into, or face the vengeful screeching of pained gears grinding against each other. Synchromesh, invented in 1919 by Earl Avery Thompson, one of the most American names I've ever heard, is a system in a manual gearbox in which special synchronizer rings do all the rev matching for you. This prevents you looking like an absolute pillock in front of your friends by accidentally shifting too early and eliciting said grinding noise, and almost as importantly prevents wear and tear on the expensive transmission gears. The downside is that it costs more money and physically takes up more space, requiring a larger gearbox. In economy cars where costs were kept down and space was limited, synchromesh was therefore forgone on first gear, as Alec Isagonis had done on the Mini, declaring it impossible to do so in such a tight space. Consequently, it's hard to imagine the magnitude of smugness emanating from the grins on Parks and Fry's faces when Imps started rolling off the production line, each one fitted with a 4-speed, all-synchromesh gearbox. According to all known laws of Isagonis, there is no way a small car can have an all-synchromesh gearbox. Its engine bay is too small to get the fat little synchronizer rings in the transmission. The Imp, of course, has them anyway. because Mikey P and T-Fry don't care what Isagonis thinks is impossible. Apart from being lighter and more advanced, the Imp's engine was also heavily canted, lowering the car's centre of gravity, which in turn boosted handling. This was only furthered through the employment of semi-trailing arm independent suspension, which was designed to negate the tail-happy nature of rear-engine cars. The more expensive semi-trailing arm had been settled on rather than cheaper swing arms after tests with an imported Chevrolet Corvair yielded unsatisfactory results, a wise choice given Ralph Nader's later hammering of the car in his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And people think clickbait is a new thing. As with the Mini, this inadvertently resulted in the Imp gripping the road like that little bit of adhesive when you try to remove a sticker. Racers began to take notice, and combined with the engine's competition heritage and endless tunability, the Imp began to make itself known in rallies and circuit races alike, just like the Mini. Among the Imp's various successes were its 1965 outright win of the 2,500km Tulip Rally in the hands of Rosemary Smith, and pulling off a hat-trick in the British Saloon Car Championship, taking home the title in 1970, 71 and 72, by which time it was 9 years old. Beyond that, the Imp proved to be a versatile platform for different variants, also like the Mini. There was a van version, a sportier coupe, an up-trimmed luxury model. Its engine was used in kit cars abound. Finally, both cars were assembled in every corner of the globe. Factories pumping out Imps could be found in Australia, Costa Rica, Ireland, Malaysia, Malta, New Zealand, the Philippines, Portugal, South Africa, Uruguay, and Venezuela. iPhone! With this in mind, it's hard not to see the Imp as a bizarro Mini, its mirrored twin. Even its name, Imp, implied a cheeky subversion of the Mini's ubiquity and its later protagonist status. Simply put, they were two sides of the same coin, the yin to the other's yang, the pre-shredded cheddar to the other's Nutella. So why did the Imp so dearly underperform compared to expectations? What key difference separated the two that ultimately made the Mini a success story and the Imp a curiosity? The answer is about 320 miles. At any given point in the UK's history, Scotland is being purposefully neglected, and at no time was this more the case in the early 1960s. Around that time, it had manifested in soaring unemployment, especially around Glasgow.
One writer wondered why anyone should ever want to go back to Glasgow. Glasgow, slum suburb of Dublin. Glasgow, a very dark place. Glasgow, dirty but vividly alive. These are some of the phrases used by visitors to describe Glasgow.
And the then Tory government under Harold Macmillan wanted to appease the Scottish and potentially win over a few votes from a traditional Labour heartland by solving that problem. So when they caught wind that Roots was going to build a new factory for a car that was supposed to be produced in the hundreds of thousands, they commanded it be built in the Glasgow area. To this end, they did provide some grants, but nothing nearly enough to compensate for the fact that Roots would be running this operation from Coventry. Roots had based themselves in the West Midlands because, simply put, everyone else had. BMC, Rover, Triumph and Jaguar all headquartered themselves there, making Coventry the UK's Detroit. Coventry was where you really needed to be if you wanted to mass-produce automobiles in the UK, because that was where the chain of supply had developed. So the government demanding that Roots build the Imp's factory about as far away from Coventry as you can possibly get without having to get your feet wet threw a spanner in the works that no amount of government grant money was going to fix. With no recourse, Roots complied, and the purpose-built computerized factory was completed in Linwood, just outside Paisley, a suburb of Glasgow. And now, for your edutainment on the nuances of Paisley, the poetical musings of Laserpig.
It is a well-known and established fact that in our universe, life as we know it depends on a series of very precise factors being present on a planet. It must be the right size and shape, gravity cannot be too high, weather not too extreme, it must be a certain distance from the sun, and it must contain water, preferably on the surface. But a lesser-known requirement is that of a large gas giant in the same solar system. With its huge mass, the gravitational pull of such a giant helps divert rogue asteroids away from the planets in the inner belt, meaning most of the time they are kept relatively safe from the worst of the impacts. Life on our planet is dependent on a vast ball of gas distracting all the crap which floats through our galaxy, sucked in and lost forever within the chaos of its crushing mass. And so it is with Linwood and Paisley, two gaseous balls of eldritch horror sucking in all the crap that surrounds it so the rest of us in Scotland can sleep peacefully, knowing we never have to live there. Paisley is rated as one of the unhappiest places to live in the world, just short of North Korean labour camps. It is Britain's fly-tipping capital, and its main export is dowdy middle-aged people pointing at potholes. It once tried to rebrand itself as Britain's capital of culture, and I have no idea how anyone on the panel of judges could keep a straight face when they handed in their application. Linwood, however, is one of my most favourite places to reference when I'm trying to confuse my American friends with a good old game of Scotland or Soviet Union. Go on, have a try. Is this Scotland or is it the Soviet Union? Ooh, how about here? Oh, what about this one? That's gotta be the Soviet Union, right? No, those were all Scotland. God help us.
The logistics turned out to be an utter nightmare. Raw engine castings were made at Linwood but had to be machined and married with their gearboxes at Roots' Ryton plant in Coventry. The utterly disgusting solution they came up with was shipping the castings to Coventry along with completed cars, where they were then turned into ready-to-go engines and shipped back up to Linwood to be put into empty body shells, making for a roughly 640-mile round trip. All this moving stuff around increased costs massively and ultimately proved to be a case of the government grabbing Roots' hand and forcing it to shoot themselves in the foot. At least back in those days, bad governments did it. These days, big corporations do it themselves by, I don't know, dropping a well-known brand image that had been successful for over a decade and replacing it with a ridiculous vanity project. Furthermore, most of the workforce at Linwood were formerly dockers and shipwrights who hadn't been properly trained to build cars. Combined with the botched launch to compete with the Mini, this meant there were, say it with me boys and girls, quality control and teething problems. Along with the ever-present management union battle when workers found out they were being paid less than their equivalents in Coventry, the fact that by the time Imps finally started rolling off the production line in 1963, the Mini had been out for 4 years, and that the British public were biased against rear-engine cars due to being seen as impoverished, you didn't exactly have to be Cassandra to predict the Imp's ultimate poor launch. Hoped yearly sales of 150,000 were dashed as a meagre 83,000 were sold in the first 2. Immediately, the planned larger Swallow and sports car Asp were cancelled, but there was hope yet as the press lauded its handling and driving characteristics. 1965 saw the launch of the Imp Mark II, which fixed many but not all of the car's reliability issues. It was around this point that the Imp started a successful rally career, raising positive publicity that did battle with the negative image that had begun to surround the car. This placed the Imp in an awkward position for Roots, as it hadn't been the massive success they needed it to be, while still selling numbers just lukewarm enough to justify keeping it in dealerships. So what do you do when you have a car that you need to sell more of, but no money to properly expand the range? That's right, badge engineer the shit out of it. There's the estate version, the aforementioned van version marketed under the commercial comma mark. Oh, that's why it's called that. There was the Mini Cooper rivaling Sunbeam Sport, the sexy Sunbeam Stiletto Coupe, and the luxury-oriented Singer Chamois with wood veneer interior. But ultimately, the structural issue of the Imp's far-flung factory was unavoidable, and Roots' big gamble turned out to be a dud. A year after the Imp's launch, Roots received an injection of funds from Chrysler in the form of the latter taking a 30% stake in the company. This proved to be a drug Roots wasn't able to kick, and by 1967 Chrysler had increased its shares to 2/3, taking full control of the group. 3 years later, the Roots Group would be renamed Chrysler UK, a subsidiary of Chrysler Europe. During this time, proposals were looked over to make a hatchback Imp to keep the old car competitive, but as Chrysler itself fell into ill health, these were rejected, forcing the Imp to live well past its expected lifespan until its eventual retirement in 1976, ending a 13-year production run and passing the baton to the Chrysler Sunbeam. While seeming to be a poor judgment from the starting line, the Imp kept fighting until its dying breath. It didn't care the factory's location was ridiculously ill thought out, it didn't care the British public had a distaste for rear-mounted engines. It was about as determined as a little car could be. Certainly more so than the effortlessly charming Mini that won hearts without even trying. Chrysler Europe would pass into the hands of Peugeot at the end of the 70s, who immediately discontinued any leftover Roots marks besides Talbot, which it would summarily banish to the realm of vans not long after. Once the Talbot Express, a rebadged Fiat Ducato, finished production in 1993, and the Peugeot 309 only a year later, Any vestige of the once titanic roots group disappeared from the road. The problematic Linwood plant had long since closed in 1981, and after the similarly Leviathan Writing Assembly was razed to the ground in the latter months of 2007, the only physical reminder of the Roots group was the place it had all started, the Roots Maidstone building. Having long been neglected as a Peugeot dealership and service centre, it will fortunately live on, as a Grade 2 historic listing has forced the new owners to restore much of the original structure as part of an ongoing apartment development. Besides that, the storied Roots brand names of Hillman, Humber, Sunbeam, Singer and Talbot exist only as trademarks of Stellantis following PSA's merger with Fiat Chrysler, reuniting Chrysler and Roots in a turn of events I'm sure neither are happy with. God, William Roots must be spinning in his grave faster than a Formula 1 engine. Although he only has himself to blame. For all Roots is struggling to create a mass-market people's car post-Suez Crisis, William Roots walked out on an opportunity to have one from the get-go. After the end of World War II, British industrialists were invited to the British-occupied sector of Germany to evaluate factories and their products for reparations. On one such occasion, William Roots was sent to evaluate a car factory. Having been subject to some of Bomber Command's finest work, much of the factory still lay as rubble on the ground, and so Roots stated that neither the factory nor the car it produced were of any value, and declined to take ownership of either. The factory was in a little town east of Hanover called Wolfsburg, and the car was the Volkswagen Beetle. Perhaps Roots was never meant to produce a people's car after all. Hello, welcome to the end of the video. I'm very sorry it took me so long to get this video out. I could have got it out probably about 2 weeks earlier, had I not got a job, because yes, I am making money off these videos now, but not enough to sustain myself, and I did have to get a job over the summer that took up some of my time. But I could make more money off these videos if you donated to my Patreon. That's fucking right, baby, we're doing this now. I'm only going to keep it to 2 tiers for now, and they'll both be quite low, because I haven't got any major rewards lined up for them. It'll just be a list of names at the end of the video, probably during this section of future videos. With that out of the way, let's get to why you're here. So one of the really cool parts of the Imp's rally story was the Tulip Rally victory with Rosemary Smith. I wish I could dedicate a whole section to Rosemary Smith, unfortunately it couldn't quite fit in, but she's really cool, obviously a pioneer of women in motorsports, and even though she's quite old now, she still regularly shows up at heritage events. In 2017, when she was 79 years old, she drove an 800 horsepower Renault F1 car around Paul Ricard. Absolutely no fucks given, slay queen. I also briefly mentioned a prototype car called the Swallow. This was a larger car built on the same principle as the Imp. It had its engine in the back and a Coventry Climax Drive Straight 4, so still all aluminium, still overhead cam, but this time it went up to 1.75 litres rather than just under 1. In terms of performance, no doubt it would have destroyed a Ford Cortina of the time, but once the Imp launched and was the relative failure that it was, they canned it and made the Roots Arrow instead, which was much more conventional. With that, as per usual, I would like to thank Nerf for making that fantastic thumbnail. I'd like to thank Laserpig for making that hilarious little interlude. And I'd like to thank my friends Harv, Pine and Enk for sitting in on test screenings. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.